Mr. Warrick, I think this was a wonderful conversation. I want to pick up on the very last thing you discussed, which is the local mosques and the imams and clerics. Where have they been? My feeling is that if they had spoken up in a broad way a long time ago, this situation might have been a lot different. What is your view of that, and why have they not spoken up until hopefully now?
That's a very good question, and thank you. It's been a really attentive audience, and I was warned ahead of time that there are probably more PhDs per capita in this room than I'll find in any audience in the country. But you know, there are a couple things I think that we can look at there. One is the fact that our good allies, the Saudis, among others, have been very busy exporting, you know, a fairly extreme or a fairly austere version of Islam throughout the world. Funding mosques, funding these madrasas in places that really didn't have sort of this jihadist tradition before. And I'm afraid they do bear some responsibility for the situation we have where this has been mainstream, this idea of this radical view that you know, is alien to a lot of countries that are Muslim around the world, but is really becoming part of the, you know, a major problem now. I do see that, you know, the things that you see that are a bit hopeful, you know, the Egyptian president, El-Sisi, no Democrat, but one thing he's managed to do in the last year is go to the Center of Sunni Islamic Learning, which is the Al-Azhar University in Cairo. And he brought the imams together, brought the grand imam, and set them all in a room together on TV, and essentially scolded them for 20 minutes and said, look what's happened to our religion. We've become you know, pariah to the world. And you, as religious leaders, need to change this. You need to be teaching something different in your universities, in your religious centers, and also down at the local mosque level. And so that's a slow process. That doesn't happen quickly. But you're starting finally, I think, to see that the Muslim world is taking this problem very seriously, and then hopefully this change comes over time. I think where we as a government can be helpful is to prod our allies, the Saudis and others, to watch how this activity is going on around. Well, you know, are you funding these madrasas that are helping, you know, radicalize the new generation? And that's a big order, but we need to be doing that, I think.
What is Turkey's role in the Middle East at this point?
And I'm sorry to chuckle about that, but Turkey has been a hard one for us to figure out, because you've got a leader in Erdogan who's positioned himself as he's essentially, he is himself an Islamist, at least in his worldview. And he sees himself as almost undoing the Ataturk revolution and turning Turkey into something that it wasn't before. And he's been very much playing both sides when it's convenient to him, bashing us constantly. That's been one theme. The West is horrible, West is evil. And yet, by kind of inciting jihadists in his own country, he's become a target of attack. You've seen all the things that have gone on in the last few weeks with you know, Ankara and Istanbul coming under serious attack from radicals, including ISIS. And there's activity along the border that they've allowed to happen. They've allowed these foreign fighters to come across. They're not coming through Jordan for the most part. They're coming through Turkey. That could be stopped if they really, really wanted to stop it. Now they're trying harder, but it's a bit too late. So I think he hasn't really helped very much. I think we're beginning to see a pivot there, but I think he's been more of part of the problem than the solution. So I'm not applying for a visa to go to Turkey anytime soon, so I could say that.
Go to the gentleman back here.
Just a footnote to the Saudi question. The Saudis have certainly helped to spread fundamentalist Islam. Are they still doing this?
We haven't seen any change in that. You know, it's interesting. The way the Saudis operate is that you know, the sort of the grand bargain that created Saudi Arabia is you have the King Fahd, and you've got the Wahhabis, the real extreme radical guys, the ones that are actually the Ikhwan, which I mentioned earlier. We have these marauding bands of you know, Islamists on horseback that went across Iraq and Jordan, just wiping out villages. You know, they were his foot soldiers back in the early 20th century. And so there's been this really interesting little you know, dance they've had to do over a century of their existence. And that, you know, they're afraid to take on those religious extremists, and they haven't really done so to any great degree. So yeah, I think that the proselytizing is still going on. We've seen in the Balkans and in other parts of Europe even, the Saudis getting behind, you know, new mosques with relatively severe, austere religious viewpoints. So I don't really think they've changed in any great degree, and that's something our policy guys need to be working on.
So I'm a fourth year at UVA, and I'm writing my thesis right now on whether or not ISIS is more technologically advanced than Al-Qaeda or other seemingly technologically advanced groups like Anonymous. So I'm monitoring some Twitter accounts and Telegram channels, and I was just wondering in your research if you've come across kind of words, more like cyber savvy words, that indicate their technological advancement. Because from what I've seen so far, it seems like they're really good at social media, but not so much kind of denial of service attacks, that kind of thing that would require more computer savvy or programming knowledge.
I think they certainly have some ambitions in the cyber realm, and they have the resources to be able to pull off something. What I spend more of my time looking at is the product. And if you look how maybe it's partly technology, but I think it's partly savvy, where you used to see, every few months, Osama bin Laden would come out with one of his videos. It'd be this old guy with the dyed beard sitting behind a podium reading a speech. Really, really boring. And we'd go on sometimes for an hour or two, as opposed to what ISIS is doing now, which is essentially now that Zarqawi is gone, they don't really play up the leaders anymore. They've created this sort of action figure jihadist, sort of multi-purpose guy in the black suit who just looks really tough and he's doing terrible things. And they've exploited that in a sophisticated way. And they've also been really, very nimble from moving from one platform to another. And if they get a Twitter account closed down, they're very quick at switching to another. They're really slick in their productions. So I think they're good at exploiting those kinds of technologies. Maybe not so much cyber, but we are seeing rumblings that they're playing with that as well, and I don't think that's at all out of the question that they'll do something in that realm.
We're all aware of the refugee crisis that's occurring now in Western Europe and escalating backlash in some cases. What impact do you think the success of ISIS is having on the assimilation of these refugees, the acceptance in certain Western European countries and even here?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate for the bulk of the refugees who are really, and I've been to these refugee camps, I've met these people. Some are really, really desperate people who just want to survive, want to get their families out of a war zone. So you do feel for those people. But I think now, because there had been the startings of this backlash in Germany and other countries, that we can't let these people into our country. We see people sneaking across the border that are really bad guys. So that door was starting to close. I think after the recent attacks in France and Brussels, that door is going to be slamming shut. And that's unfortunate. You see this deal now we've made with Turkey where they're going to be warehousing more of them. But I think these are going to be people without a country until the conflict in Syria is over. That's the only really hope we have, is that somehow that conflict will end, and maybe the Russians are, with their little game they're playing with going in and coming out and maybe hoping to push the negotiations along to a real settlement, so eventually these guys can go back home. But they're going back to a destroyed country, so it's not going to be happening very soon.
And also remarkable that pretty high probability that there'll be major political changes all across Europe as a result of this. Angela Merkel will probably be destroyed by all of this. So you have the most visionary, most effective leader in Europe will almost certainly lose power because of all of this. And so where do you end up? You have an infantilizing of the European political spectrum that is not all that different from the infantilization we're going through in the United States, it would seem.
With the same kinds of messaging, and it's really distressing to see that this idea of stopping all refugees coming to this country is being used as a political bludgeon now, that bills being introduced in Congress that aren't going to go anyplace, but it's just a way to show we're going to be tough on refugees, we're not going to let any of these bad guys into our country. And it's a bad message for us to be sending, and it's really against our values. And we've usually, first of all, we screen our refugees very well. It's often a months and years long process for someone to come here as a refugee, and for us to say that no more, we're not going to have them in this country, again plays into ISIS's narrative about being anti-Islam.
John Norton Moore of the law faculty here at the University of Virginia. In what ways has Iran interfaced with ISIS?
Iran is a target as well. They see ISIS as the enemy, and I think it's telling. We see the things that happen in Western Europe, but you don't talk about real atrocities. It's what ISIS and its predecessors have done to the Shiite population of Iraq in particular. So there's a great animosity by the Iranians toward the Shia. On the other hand, toward ISIS. On the other hand, that it's been interesting to me to see that seem to have taken some pleasure in the predicament that we're in. They've, you know, I just saw that some Iranian minister was getting up and talking about the Brussels attack and saying, you guys had this coming because you didn't support Assad, who was the real hero of the region, who was a guy who's for stability and for sensible government. Because you didn't support Assad, you've allowed these guys to come in and destroy Syria and half the Middle East. So they're using it for their own propaganda purposes, even though I think they're as afraid of ISIS as we are. Good question.
What do you make of the, and we'll take this lady's question here in just a second with them, of the American approach that, like, I remember back to, and this would have been in early 2002, but shortly after the success of the action in Afghanistan, which Pakistan was central to, absolutely critical to our ability to do what was done against the Taliban and against Al-Qaeda at the beginning. And then shortly after that, a tariff exception for Pakistan came up in Congress. It was expiring on, they were exempted from tariffs on T-shirts, undershirts made in Pakistan, shipped to the United States. And in the midst of all this, immediately after this sort of great victory, it seemed, in Afghanistan, there's a spirited debate in Congress over whether this tariff exception should be extended, and there are speeches on the floor of the House saying, we can't allow things like this because this will take jobs away from mill workers in North Carolina. And so in the end, we denied this tariff, this extension of this tariff, to the country that had just played such a critical role in the success there. And I thought at the time that we're doomed. We're just doomed if we can't have enough longevity, in our view of the world to realize that, okay, we have to do something as simple as this. That we can't do that. Even that can be spoiled by our weird internal politics, and so we can't hold on to even an ally like this in such a critical struggle for the country. Yeah,
I always I covered the State Department for some time, and it's always struck me that whenever it was budget time, how people would lash out at foreign aid. That first of all, people imagining that we're giving just huge amounts of money to other countries. Relatively, it's pretty small. And you see what the programs are when you go to these countries, and for things for like safe drinking water, things like hospitals, youth programs, things that are fairly minor, but hopefully projecting a good image of the United States and helping build, hopefully civil societies and democracies. And yet you have people in this country that just want to slash those programs and say we're giving away all our money to outsiders, and it's just, short-sighted to say the least, and it often is very harmful to our image abroad.
On my drive here, I happened to catch a few minutes of the Diane Rehm show on NPR, which happened to be about the rise of ISIS today also. And one of the panelists mentioned that—
Ours was better. You were much better. Much better.
No comparison. One of the panelists mentioned that Al-Qaeda traditionally targeted faraway targets for terror, the US and Western Europe, whereas ISIS traditionally targets the Arab world and the Middle East, and he was saying that these attacks in Brussels and Paris were anomalies. Do you agree?
Yeah, there's tension between Al-Qaeda and ISIS on a number of levels. They disagree over tactics, but the other thing they really disagree over is what the priority should be. For Osama bin Laden, it was the far enemy, and that's the term they used, that we're going to weaken the West, or we're going to make them very unhappy about being in our part of the world. So they're going to let these countries alone. They're going to let Egypt alone. They're going to let Jordan alone. So we're going to be able to eventually take over these places. And one day we're going to build our caliphate. We're going to own the place again. ISIS has it exactly the opposite, that they're going to build this caliphate, and then they're going to project out. Then they're going to fight, this great end times battle in the Middle East. But what's happened now in the last few months is this sort of changing of their timeline. They've sped up this sort of the reaching out part because they see themselves under threat at home. They see themselves sometimes in competition with Al-Qaeda groups. And so there's this sort of a race to see who can be more powerful, who project the most force, who can cause the most problems for the West. And so, you saw the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which was essentially an Al-Qaeda group. Then you see the attacks in Paris in November of last year. And so there's all kinds of reasons why they're kind of competing against each other to do terrible things abroad. But I do think that ISIS's main priority remains, even with the stuff they're doing in Europe, to build this caliphate, because they think it's almost the field of dreams for them. If you build it, people will come to it. They're going to hang on to it for all they're worth.
And it's important to remember, and we lose track of it in the U.S., that Al-Qaeda and ISIS fought a war with each other. I mean, literally. So we tend to lapse into a set of assumptions that all these terrorist groups are actually somehow at least roughly sympathetic to one another, but in ISIS in particular, though, has not felt the need to preserve any kind of Muslim unity.
And just to add to that, some people may be familiar with a group in Syria called the Al-Nusra Front. These are essentially the first people that the ISIS sent to Syria to join the revolution. They were going to be one of the rebel groups fighting the Assad government. But turned out that Al-Nusra government, the Al-Nusra Front, really wanted to fight Syria, really wanted to be part of this anti-Syria coalition. And ISIS really didn't want any of that. They didn't care about the Syrian revolution. They wanted to build their caliphate. So they split with Al-Nusra Front. Al-Nusra Front goes and joins with Al-Qaeda, and now the two are fighting each other. Just a few days ago, or just in the recent past, there was a big massacre of Al-Nusra Front fighters by ISIS. So they're actually killing each other as well as they're killing Assad's troops and everybody else that gets in their way.
You hadn't mentioned, or at least I don't think you mentioned, the state of Israel and our relationship with Israel. I wish you'd comment on that and how it might bear on our ability to create the coalescence that you've talked about in the Arab world.
That's a real good question. Part of ISIS's propaganda always is Israel. That eventually, that sort of the ultimate target is to retake the state of Israel, to make it disappear. But practically speaking, Israel's managed to be fairly insulated from a lot of all this. They've got really good defenses on the borders. They haven't been, they've been able to exclude all these bad guys from coming in. The one effect that I've seen has been that because of this general radicalization and sort of people who want to be like ISIS, you see some of the Palestinian youths trying to do the same thing. You've always seen suicide bombings and the Intifada and that kind of thing, but there's this new element to it, I think, that's very much ISIS-inspired. And you see kind of a breaking away from the traditional allies, Hezbollah, from Hamas, who have been seen as more Al-Qaeda aligned or Iranian aligned, and more kind of people looking at these ISIS folks as heroes. And I think that's a long-term problem for the Israelis. They've been pretty good about keeping the violence contained. I'm not sure if they'll be able to do that long-term.
Thank you so much. That was spectacular.
Thank you.